Welcome to the Regulatory Transparency Project's fourth branch podcast series. All expressions of opinion are those of the speaker.
Welcome to the Regulatory Transparency Project's Explainer podcast on the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. My name is Steve Schaefer. I'm the director of the Federalist Society's Regulatory Transparency Project. We're pleased to have with us Ken Davis, who is a member of the Executive Committee of the Administrative Law and Regulation Practice Group, also a member of the Regulatory Process Working Group for Regulatory Transparency Project, and he is an energy and regulatory attorney with more than 40 years of experience in corporate management, public service, private practice, just all the way around has served in both the public sector as well as in the private sector. So Ken, earlier this year, the U.S. Energy Information Administration reported that the nation's Strategic Petroleum Reserve, or SPR, held approximately 358 million barrels, which is its lowest level in 40 years. I guess to start with, is that a problem? And for those who may not be familiar, what is the Strategic Petroleum Reserve and how is it, supposed to operate?
Well, thank you, Steve. This is a good opportunity to discuss this important subject that, like so many things, doesn't get the attention it deserves in a lot of the day-to-day news coverage. Now, the history first of the Petroleum Reserve, the SPR. The international policy responses to the supply disruptions and price spikes created by the OPEC oil embargo in 73 and 74 included the creation of the International Energy Agency. The IEA is an intergovernmental organization whose 31 members, including the United States, come together to develop coordinated plans and policies among the members for emergency responses to energy crises. Strategic petroleum stockpiles are one policy included in the agency's International Energy Program that it has developed. The International Energy Program, or IEP. Now, members of the IEA and IEP signatories, including the United States, have committed to hold petroleum reserves equivalent to at least 90 days of their respective net petroleum imports, their imports minus their exports.
So what actions did the United States take to fulfill its obligations as a signatory to the IEP?
Well, in 1975, Congress passed the Energy Policy and Conservation Act, the EPCA. It's Public Law 94-163. And that act authorized the creation of the SPR and its management by the Department of Energy. Now, that public law is codified mostly in 42 U.S.C. 6231 through 6247.
So for those that are unfamiliar with the SPR, where is the reserve actually located?
Well, it's really a massive physical facility. It's comprised of a series of very large underground salt caverns located in Texas and Louisiana, along the Gulf Coast, right in the sort of heart of the country's petroleum activity. It's near our country's largest complex of refineries, interstate pipelines, and marine terminals. Now, the government, the Secretary of Energy, uses a variety of market transactions to acquire oil for the reserve. And filling actually began in 1977. And in 2009, the reserve held its then full capacity of 727 million barrels.
So that would mean with the recently reported storage level of 358 million barrels that the reserve is only about half full. Is that right?
That is correct. In 2021 and 2022, anticipating the disruption of Russian oil flows and a surge of prices because of the conflict in Ukraine, President Biden ordered the most aggressive withdrawals from the reserve in its 50-year history, over 200 million barrels. Now, critics of the president have questioned the prudence of those withdrawals and voiced concern that such a substantial depletion of the reserve poses a serious threat to our national security. Should, for example, the current conflict in the Middle East, escalate and disrupt international supplies.
So, what authority does the president have to order withdrawals from the SPR?
Well, authority for withdrawal of petroleum from the SPR and sale of the petroleum that's withdrawn through public auction is codified in 42 U.S.C. Section 6241. Now, there are several authorized reasons for withdrawal. The Secretary of Energy is authorized to withdraw and sell petroleum if the President issues a finding that, 1, a severe price-spiking energy supply interruption exists, or 2, withdrawal would assist directly and significantly in preventing or mitigating the adverse impact of severe domestic energy supply disruptions, or 3, withdrawals and sales are needed for the U.S. to meet its crisis response obligations under the IEP. Now, all of these authorities were relied on with reference to the pandemic and the recovery from the pandemic and the invasion of Ukraine for the substantial withdrawals in 2021 and 2022. Now, these authorities are broadly defined, and so the criticism that was leveled at President Biden for these withdrawals was not so much that he didn't have the authority, but that he, as a matter of policy, should not have done what he did.
So I guess this brings up the question, in the context of other times and under different administrations, have other emergency withdrawals been made from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve?
Yes, they have. Other presidents have authorized withdrawals. The emergency withdrawals, these include withdrawals, for example, in connection with Desert Shield and Desert Storm in 1990, Hurricane Katrina in 2005, and the Libyan upheaval in 2011.
And you had previously, cited the legal authority under Section 6241. Are there any other kinds of withdrawals from the SPR that are authorized under that section?
There are, in addition to the emergency withdrawals. Withdrawals and sales are also authorized under that section to periodically test the functionality of the reserve's infrastructure. I mean, when an emergency arises, the pumps and all the infrastructure has to work, and there can't be any doubt about that. So periodically, there are test withdrawals to make sure all the equipment is in operating order. And these kind of withdrawals have been made from time to time, including those made, for example, in 1985, 1990, and 2014.
And are there any other reasons for withdrawals that presidents decide to authorize?
Well, in addition to those authorized under Section 6241, since 2015, Congress has, from time to time, and every year, for example, from 2017 through 2022, specifically mandated sales of specified amounts of SPR petroleum to raise money for the general fund of the U.S. Treasury. And finally, in addition to those mandated sales, so-called modernization sales have been made over the years and authorized under various laws to raise money to repair, replace, and upgrade parts of the SPR infrastructure. Modernization sales include those made in 2017, 18, and 19.
So with all these withdrawals and the SPR at its lowest level in 40 years, are there any reported plans to replenish the reserve?
There are. Right at the end of 2022, after the Biden administration made those significant emergency drawdowns, the administration announced its intention to purchase oil for the reserve. But despite that announcement, so far progress has been pretty slow. Only about 30 million barrels have been restored to the reserve from the over 200 withdrawn.
Is there any indication why the replenishment has been at a slow pace?
Well, the administration stated from the start that it wants to purchase oil when the price is somewhere between $68 and $78 a barrel. Now, for most of the time since their announcement to repurchase and replenish, the price has been higher than that. Currently, for example, just this week, it's a bit above $83. And so the administration, citing its planned price range, the administration has made clear it's not in a rush to change its purchase plan.
So why is that? From your point of view, I know that it's there's a lot of conflict around the world, and especially in the headlines with regards to the Middle East. Do you have any insight as to why there seems to be this action by this?
Why they're not in a rush? Yeah. Well, during the 1970s, the United States was extremely dependent on oil imports from the Middle East. That's why the OPEC embargo had such a devastating effect. That's why the SPR was established. But since then, two very significant developments have occurred that drastically reduce the exposure we have from another OPEC-style disruption arising from troubles in the Middle East.
So what are you had referenced some significant developments that have occurred? What are those?
Well, first, the imports, again, in the 70s, much of our imported petroleum came from the Middle East and from OPEC members. But today, in stark contrast, Much more of our imports come from more reliable producers such as Canada. But second, and this is the most important, the most significant change, our own domestic production of oil has soared as a result of fracking and related improvements. In 2023, the United States was the leading oil producer in the world at just under 13 million barrels per day, well ahead of Russia at 10 million per day, and even Saudi Arabia at 9.7. And as 2024 begins to unfold, the United States is topping 13 million barrels per day and producing more oil than any single country in history. In 1973, U.S. net imports of crude and petroleum products were running between 5.3 million and 6.7 million barrels per day. But by the end of 2021, and because of these changes in fracking and related improvements in the industry, the situation had changed dramatically. The U.S. has become a consistent net exporter. Since October 2021, U.S. net exports of crude and petroleum products have risen significantly, from around 90,000 barrels per day to levels frequently higher than 1 million barrels per day. In 2023, the U.S. was a net petroleum exporter of an average of 1.64 million barrels per day, a remarkable change from the 70s.
So ultimately, what does this mean for the United States commitment as a signatory to the International Energy Program, where it committed to maintain an emergency petroleum stockpile equal in size to at least 90 days of its net imports?
Well, it means that we have more than met and greatly exceeded all our obligations. Formally speaking, under the IEP, net exporters are not required to maintain a strategic stockpile to back up their crisis response commitments. Moreover, under the same IEP, signatories, including the United States, can draw on or rely on for their emergency response responsibilities, draw on their country's commercial petroleum stocks, in addition to their strategic stockpiles, to meet their commitments to help respond to a crisis. And the United States commercial stocks of crude and petroleum products are enormous. They currently total over 1.23 billion barrels.
Does this mean that, all things considered, there's no longer a reason to maintain the Strategic Petroleum Reserve?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, the large drawdown of the SPR, the resulting criticism and calls for replenishment, and all the other public discussion recently, and the dramatically altered nature of the U.S. petroleum industry, all of these developments, all of these factors reveal a serious need, a pressing need for a thoroughgoing review of national energy security policy and an adjustment of that policy to fully account for all the dramatic changes that have occurred since 1973. Now, such a review must address a number of important questions. For example, even if it's not formally required by the IEP for the U.S. to maintain a strategic petroleum reserve, are there, looking at our situation today, are there security and economic reasons for us to maintain a reserve? And if so, how large should it be? Also, we need to keep in mind that the Biden administration has placed a number of restrictions on domestic crude production and the expansion of U.S. refineries. How should such restrictions factor into the analysis that we need to go through for an effective review? That needs to be addressed. And also, as another example, U.S. refineries require a combination of crude oil grades, depending on the equipment in the refineries, different grades. Some of those are produced domestically and some abroad. And given that, what might be an appropriate mix of oils in any updated SPR that the country maintains? But these are all the type of questions, and there are many more of the same general kind that need to be answered as a part of this review, because so much has changed in 50 years. Policymakers need to address and answer these questions, and they should do it sooner than later. They should begin to do it now, because we don't want to wait for the next crisis to break before we evaluate and update our energy security policy.
Ken, if listeners want to learn more about the SPR and the issues that you've presented today, where would you suggest that they start?
Well, one really good place to start is with the publications of the U.S. Energy Information Administration. They put out a wealth of data on the reserve and the imports and exports of the United States and the oil industry in general. Also, the Congressional Research Service has published a series of very, very informative reports, background reports, and status updates on the SPR. And finally, I also would mention that the Dallas Federal Reserve Bank is a very useful source of additional information about the SPR and related considerations.
Well, Ken, thank you so much for being with us today. And thanks to all of our listeners for learning about this very important subject. Thank you.
On behalf of the Federalist Society's Regulatory Transparency Project, thanks for tuning in to the Fourth Branch podcast. To catch every new episode when it's released, you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spreaker. For the latest from RTP, please visit our website at regproject.org. That's regproject.org.
This has been a FedSoc audio production.